Here is a story about one of America's most famous serial killers. The stories say he murdered as many as 200 people, mostly young women who came to Chicago for the World's Fair of 1893. The stories say he owned a murder castle filled with gas chambers, hidden doors, booby traps, and a crematorium. The stories say his name was H. Holmes. The stories are lying. Welcome, friend, to JL's History's Mysteries. Sit by our fire and let us share a story. On the evening of June 26, 1895, Detective Frank Geyer boarded a train out of Philadelphia, carrying photographs of 3 children and a stack of letters they had written home. The children had been missing for 8 months. The letters had never been mailed. The man who kept them was sitting in a Philadelphia prison. Geyer had spent 20 years in the city's detective bureau. He had worked murders before, but this assignment came with no crime scene and no reliable last address. District Attorney George Graham gave him one instruction: follow wherever the clues led. The missing children were Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitezel. Their father, Benjamin, was already dead. Benjamin Pitezel had been a carpenter, an inventor, a husband, a father of 5, and a long-time associate of the man calling himself H. Holmes. In 1894, the 2 men planned to cheat Fidelity Mutual out of a $10,000 life insurance policy. Pitezel would take a false name, stage his death in Philadelphia, and disappear. Holmes would provide a cadaver damaged beyond easy recognition. Carrie Pitezel would identify the body, collect the policy, and divide the money. Pitezel opened a small patent office at 1316 Callow Hill Street under the name B.F. Perry. Then Holmes changed the plan. He killed Pitezel with chloroform, burned part of the body to suggest an accident, and used the real corpse to collect the policy. The fraud worked because Carrie still believed her husband was alive. Holmes told her Benjamin had gone into hiding and the family would reunite when the danger passed. He persuaded her to place Alice, Nellie, and Howard in his care. Then he moved Carrie and her 2 other children along a separate route, always promising that Benjamin and the missing children were 1 city ahead. Holmes might have escaped with the money if he had paid one debt. While jailed in St. Louis on another matter, he had promised outlaw Marion Hedgepeth $500 for the name of a lawyer willing to help with the insurance fraud. Holmes never paid him. Hedgepeth told the authorities. Pinkerton detectives followed the complaint to Boston, where Holmes was arrested on November 17, 1894. The insurance fraud began to come apart. Benjamin was dead. The 3 children were gone. In Holmes's possessions, investigators found a tin box. Inside were 10 or 12 letters Alice and Nellie had written to their mother and grandparents from Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Detroit. The girls had handed every letter to Holmes for mailing. He kept every one. Holmes continued writing to Carrie from prison. In one letter he asked, "Can you imagine me killing little and innocent children, especially without any motive?" By then, Alice, Nellie, and Howard had been dead for months. Those letters were the case Frank Geyer carried west. Geyer reached Cincinnati on June 27th. He spent the next morning at police headquarters, laid out his photographs, and began with the hotel registers near the railroad stations. At the Atlantic House, he found A.E. Cook and 3 children registered on September 28th. At the Hotel Bristol, he found the same name and 3 children the following night. A clerk recognized Holmes, Alice, Nellie, and Howard from the photographs. The first alias had become a route. Geyer knew Holmes preferred rented houses, so he left the hotels and began visiting real estate offices. One clerk remembered Holmes arriving with Howard. The office records led to 305 Poplar Street, rented under the name A.C. Hayes. A neighbour remembered a wagon stopping outside. The only piece of furniture unloaded was a large iron cylinder stove. Holmes, the boy, and the stove remained for less than 2 days. Before leaving, Holmes gave the stove to the neighbour. Geyer could not yet explain it. He wrote down the address and moved to Indianapolis. The work became slower there. Hotel after hotel, rental office after rental office. Photographs placed the children in the city, but every address ended with another departure. The witnesses remembered a neat, well-dressed man travelling with children. They remembered his easy manner. They remembered different names. That was the pattern Geyer began to see. Holmes did not vanish. He became someone else. He had been born Herman Webster M.U.D. Jitt in New Hampshire, earned a medical degree at the University of Michigan, and adopted the name H. H. Holmes while moving through businesses, marriages, and debts. He bought goods on credit, forged papers, shifted property between aliases, and left other people holding the bills. He also maintained 3 wives in 3 states. Each knew the version of him she needed to trust. Holmes had left several paths under several names. The letters told Geyer which one to take. From Indianapolis, the trail ran through Chicago and into Detroit. There, Geyer discovered the scale of Holmes's control. Carrie Pitezel and 2 of her children had been living within a few blocks of Alice and Nellie. Holmes visited both groups. He carried every message. He decided who could know which address. Mother and daughters passed through the same city without meeting. Alice kept writing. She wrote about the cold. She asked for warmer clothing. She described her meals and a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Then she wrote, "I wish I could see you all." One sentence changed the shape of Geyer's search. "Howard is not with us now." Alice did not say where her brother had gone. The last confirmed trace of all 3 children together was Indianapolis. The girls had continued to Detroit. Howard had not. Alice had divided one impossible case into 2. Quick one before we keep going. If you're enjoying the mystery, hit like and subscribe, and pull up to the fire again next week. All right, back to it. The letters carried Geyer across the Canadian border to Toronto. He joined Detective Alf Cuddy and began the same work again. Hotels, rental agents, newspaper advertisements. Most of the leads went nowhere. Then police received a report about a man who had rented a house on St. Vincent Street for 1 week the previous October. At number 18, a neighbour named Thomas Rives studied Geyer's photographs. He recognized Holmes. He recognized Alice. He also remembered lending Holmes a spade. Rives went inside and returned with it. The same spade Holmes had borrowed months earlier was carried next door to number 16. The woman living there led Geyer and Cuddy through the kitchen. Beneath a piece of oilcloth was a small trap door. Below it was the cellar. Geyer pushed the spade into the earth until he found a soft section in the southwest corner. The ground gave easily. At a depth of 3 feet, the search ended. Alice and Nellie were beneath the floor. Geyer had found the girls. Howard was still missing. He returned to Indianapolis and began again. The earlier search had produced houses Holmes considered, hotels he used, and witnesses who had seen the boy. This time a rental lead carried investigators beyond the city to a cottage in Irvington. Holmes had rented it under another name and arrived with Howard. Searchers opened the stove and chimney. They found teeth and burned bone. Howard had never left Indianapolis. The children had not been waiting for a reunion. Their continued existence threatened the lie Holmes had sold their mother. Benjamin's death could be exposed as murder. The insurance money could be challenged. Holmes had solved those problems by killing a father and 3 children. Geyer's route gave prosecutors the family case in full. Holmes went on trial in Philadelphia in October 1895 for Benjamin Pitezel's murder. He was convicted of that one murder and sentenced to death. But the news from Toronto and Indianapolis had already opened another investigation. It ran backward from Benjamin Pitezel to the people who had disappeared around Holmes in Chicago. Before the Pitezels, there were 5 names. Julia Connor lived and worked in Holmes's building with her husband and young daughter Pearl. Her husband left after discovering Julia's relationship with Holmes. Julia remained with Pearl. Both disappeared around Christmas 1891. Holmes first said Julia had gone to visit a dying sister. Then he said she had fled from her former husband. Later he said she died during an abortion and admitted to one of his lawyers that he had killed her. Pearl disappeared with her. Bones found during the Chicago investigation may have been Pearl's, but the science of 1895 could not settle it. The next name was Emmeline Sigrand. She came to work for Holmes in 1892. They had a personal and business relationship. Then Emmeline vanished. Holmes claimed she had left Chicago to marry a man who probably never existed. Soon after her disappearance, an articulator named Charles Chappell said Holmes brought him a female cadaver to prepare. The body was never proved to be Emmeline's. The timing stayed in the case. Then came Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie controlled property in Fort Worth, Texas. Holmes drew her into his personal life and business schemes, moved her property through papers carrying his aliases, and continued using her name after she disappeared. Her sister Nanny joined her in Chicago in 1893. She disappeared too. Holmes eventually blamed Minnie for Nanny's death, claimed he had disposed of Nanny's body, and offered several incompatible endings for Minnie. The property remained useful. The sisters did not return. Julia, Pearl, Emmeline, Minnie, Nanny. Their bodies were never positively identified. Their disappearances, Holmes's lies, the property trail, and his later admissions make them the 5 probable victims added to the 4 Pitezels. That is how the count reaches roughly 9. 9 people Holmes knew, an associate, 3 children, employees, lovers and women tied to his property and debts. The Chicago building connected several of them. So after Geyer found the children, police searched it and reporters filled the street. They found odd rooms, concealed spaces, medical equipment, and a large kiln installed for a doubtful glass-bending company. They also found the perfect shape for a newspaper story. Every locked room became a chamber. Every chute became a path for bodies. The kiln became a crematorium. Every person ever rumored missing in Chicago became another possible victim. The 9 named people began to disappear beneath the castle. Newspapers drew floor plans and labeled them torture chamber, asphyxiation room, secret shaft, and crematory. They placed Holmes near the World's Fair and supplied him with a crowd of young women. The building became a machine. The murderer became its architect. Holmes read the coverage from prison. He understood exactly what the papers were buying. On April 12, 1896, Hearst's New York Journal published Holmes's confession to 27 murders. It covered almost 3 full newspaper pages. Holmes wrote that murder began as a way to make money. Then he claimed it became an appetite. He described his face changing until he resembled Satan. He supplied poisoned women, smothered children, men burned alive, 27 murders, and 6 attempts. Several of his victims survived the confession. Kate Durkee was alive. Robert Latimer was alive and working near the castle. Dr. Robert Leacock had died of natural causes years after Holmes claimed to have murdered him. L.W. Warner, whom Holmes said he roasted in the castle kiln, was alive to read about his own death. The kiln existed. Warner survived. The story kept the murder. A contemporary newspaper reported that Holmes was paid $7,500 for the confession. That is roughly $300,000 in today's consumer purchasing power. The same report said the money had been settled on Holmes's son, Robert, who was 16. No contract or trust record has surfaced, so the exact arrangement is gone. What Holmes gained is plain. He could not buy his way off the gallows. He could still turn the gallows into an asset. The confession produced money for his family, another national audience, and control over the version of himself that people would carry forward. The courts could execute his body once. The newspapers could sell the monster every morning. Holmes was hanged on May 7th, 1896. At his request, his coffin was buried beneath concrete. A man who had handled bodies as property made his own body difficult to steal. The confession survived him. In 1940, Herbert Asbury's Gem of the Prairie raised the victim count to 200 without producing 200 names. In 2003, Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City placed Holmes beside Daniel Burnham and the creation of the Chicago World's Fair. Larson identified speculative scenes in his notes. Readers remembered the scenes. The fair gave Holmes millions of possible victims. The castle gave him a perfect method. The confession gave the story his signature. Frank Geyer had found something else. Benjamin Pitezel, Alice, Nellie, Howard, Julia Connor, Pearl, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie Williams, Nanny Williams. 200 victims made Holmes a legend. 9 names tell us what he was. Holmes kept the letters. Frank Geyer read them. That was enough. That's where the trail goes cold for tonight. If you want another Mystery by the Fire, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one.